Nick Carboni joins us to give his thoughts on All-Star Weekend, and we start our player profiles getting ready for the last 22 games. Today, we'll talk about Terry Rozier, all here on the Locked On Hornets podcast.
You are Locked On Hornets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
In a minute, cuz we live.
3, 2, 1.
Thanks for joining us on the Locked On Hornets podcast. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team every day, local experts on the #1 daily sports podcast network. Thanks for making us your first listen. Check us out on all the platforms. Check us out on YouTube as well. You can find us on Twitter at Walker Mail, Doug Branson, LOH, Locked On Hornets, and our guest, Nick Carboni, on Twitter at Nick Carboni, WCNC. Nick, how are you doing today, man?
I'm good, man. How are you guys?
We're doing well. We appreciate you hopping on. Just coming off of the All-Star Weekend high, at least on Sunday from the game that we watched, not necessarily on Saturday from the dunk contest or anything revolving Saturday night, but at least we got to see Lamelo Ball play really well. We gave our thoughts. We praised Lamelo for having what was a sensational All-Star debut, 18 points. He 7 of 11 from the field. We went through the stat line. What were your thoughts on watching Lamelo, the lone Hornet representative, this All-Star weekend?
Yeah, it just like a lot of things with Lamelo here in his second year as he's 20 years old and kind of budding into superstar. It just kind of it was fun to watch, and it was also fun to envision what it could look like future All-Star games. He could be in those moments that Steph and LeBron were in towards the end of that game. He was in a lot more moments than I thought he would be. I mean, you always wonder when the guy from the Hornets goes to All-Star weekend, like, how much is he going to play? Are they going to pass him the ball? Like, he really had a fun game. I think that between that and the Rising Stars Challenge, you could tell, like, even the broadcasts at certain points were kind of centered around talking about him and how excited people are to watch him grow, even from the outside. Thank God he got in. Thank God that there was a way to rightfully get him in, because he clearly showed that he belonged. It was a fun weekend to kind of keep track of him and what he was doing and what he was wearing. And it was a nice shiny distraction from how the Hornets closed heading into the break.
Yeah, it's a good point. It was a nice, shiny distraction. The suit, the play, all of it. And he was the focal point of some talking points as well. When you talk about the between the legs pass to DeJounte Murray, I was listening back to the at least radio broadcast, and PJ Carlissimo, he was discussing how Lamelo will do that in a regular season game.
Yeah, it's not just the All-Star game.
Yeah, and that's true. That's literally true. We saw
the one he pulled off in the regular season was better.
Like yeah, it might have been.
He still got it done in the All-Star game. Don't get me wrong, but the one he pulled off to Miles was actually, I thought, like, degree of difficulty, like transitioning the ball, like, it was better. I mean, the fact that he does that, you're right though, in regular season games and not just this kind of offensive showcase, shows you how special he is.
Well, and what's cool is that, so T-Mac obviously had the off the backboard dunk to himself in an All-Star game, and then he did it in the regular season after. This kind of reverse, it reminded me of T-Mac. Another cool thing is Lamelo gave a shout to Jamal Crawford, how much he looks up to him and how he's kind of patterned his game a little bit. At first he says, my favorite player is Lamelo. I only patterned my game off of Lamelo. And then when Shaq and the TNT crew started to dig in a little bit, he said, all right, well, Jamal Crawford, I'll do that as well. And we remember the highlight where Jamal goes between his legs and throws an alley to Blake Griffin. So kind of doing that as well. Kind of cool to see that all from Lamelo. Doug, I want to get to just a couple of things that we missed yesterday and then go to Terry Rozier, the second and the third segment. And so we were talking about how Lamelo did have the best All-Star debut among any Hornet that was drafted by Charlotte.
Yeah.
But I think we can expand that. Like, I was actually digging a little more, and you looked up the Glenn Rice box score, had 7 points. And of course, Glenn Rice would have the most points in a quarter All-Star game history. That was crazy. But then you look at Eddie Jones, not necessarily a great All-Star game from him. His lone time, he made it with the Hornets. I looked at Gerald Wallace. Gerald Wallace only had like a bucket, didn't play very much, which, is not surprising going back and looking at it. I remember that kind of when he made it in 2010. And you look at some of these other Hornets that have done it, like LaMelo just flat out had the best all-star debut in Hornets history ever. It doesn't matter if they were drafted by it. And so drafted by Charlotte. So I thought that was pretty cool, even compared to everybody else. LaMelo still is on top.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you wouldn't. Listen, we do research.
Right.
It may take us a couple of episodes, but eventually, I just wanted to be careful,
right? That's
fine.
Just
make sure I wasn't missing something. But yeah, I mean, it was incredible. It was great to see, and I think, coming away from that All-Star weekend, it would have been missing something without LaMelo. LaMelo brought a level of razzle-dazzle and a level of youthful energy that I think would have been sorely missing had he not participated.
Yeah, it really would have been unfortunate. And real quickly, we wouldn't have been able to see LaMelo. That would have been bad. I don't know what's going on with the Zoom, but we can't see you either. And I feel like that's bad, Doug, because I want to see your shiny face. I want to see it right back at me. Is there any way that we can make? There we go. There's Doug. Doug, it's great to see you, man. Thanks for joining.
I thought he was like kind of pulling a man behind the curtain.
Yeah, I thought just going
Not
producer.
Purposeful. Yeah, LaMelo, the 4th youngest NBA All-Star ever. I mean, when you kind of think about that and how that fits into all the perspective, and I think his 18 points were tied with, was it Kobe or I think for like the most at his age. So that was, when you really like think about it in that perspective, it just provides so much hope and optimism for what future seasons for LaMelo will look like.
Yeah, absolutely. The legacy, it projects well compared to other Charlotte Hornets and what we can certainly see from him. All right, let's go to Terry Rozier. What'll happen the final 22 games? How has Terry looked in his 3rd season with the Charlotte Hornets? That's what we'll talk about coming up next. But not before we talk about Bet Online. Football might be over for the year, but basketball, it's in full steam for both pro and college hoops. From all the latest odds, totals, player performance props to where the next fired coach is going to land, BetOnline.net is the #1 spot for all your sports betting needs. BetOnline remains the best spot for all your sports scores, podcasts, news this season. And it's not just basketball. BetOnline.net is your source for hockey, boxing, UFC odds, right to the Olympic coverage and information. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and the action. BetOnline, where the game starts. Let's focus on Terry Rozier coming up next on the Locked On Hornets podcast.
This is Locked On Hornets.
You give them the pink to let them know you have a little bit of a softer side, but you give them the black to let them know it's still real out here. Don't run up on me, okay? I just got to let you know it's still real.
It's time for more of the Locked On Hornets podcast.
I mentioned it when James Borrego talked after the double overtime loss against Miami, how he said, here we have the final 22 games coming up. And it shook me because I didn't expect it to be that little. Like we are really very close to the end of the season, way closer than we usually are when the All-Star break ends. And it's always kind of like past the halfway point, but never this close to the end of the season. And so the Hornets have a lot of ground to make up. What we're going to do this week, we're going to focus on some of the star players, at least the pillar players for the Charlotte Hornets more so. Terry today. We'll focus on Miles Bridges tomorrow. We'll do something special Thursday, right, Doug? You've got something special special recorded in a couple of days.
Yeah, I joined up with some of the other Locked On hosts from teams that are also in play-in contention in the Eastern Conference. I know that fans of this show want the Hornets to be in playoffs contentions, and they may very well be. But I joined up with some other hosts in play-in contention, and we did a little bit of a round table, so you'll hear that on Thursday.
Cool. And then so Friday as well, we'll talk about PJ, maybe, kind of go around Gordon Hayward. What do we expect from him? Jalen McDaniels, all that. So that is what you can expect coming up this week. We'll focus on Terry now. It's an interesting year for Terry because, this is someone that just got paid $25 million a year to be a Charlotte Hornet for the next however many seasons until the Hornets trade him. That's his only way out, really. So when you look at what he did at the beginning of the season, he had that injury and he tried to give it a go. The second game of the season against Cleveland was a non-factor, scored just 6 points, made 1 field goal, clearly wasn't ready to go. So then he waited like a week and a half, a couple of weeks, came back, still struggled mightily shooting the basketball from deep and didn't get going until basically in the middle of November until he started to look like Terry Rozier shooting the basketball again. And now you look at the month of February, he hasn't been shooting nearly as well. So it's kind of been this bell curve season for him. At the beginning, he was bad. In the middle, he started to look like Terry again. And at the end, he hasn't been shooting well here recently, ending on what was a really bad game against the Miami Heat. Double overtime loss, only hit 2 field goals, scored 5 points. And that's with 2 overtimes added to regulation as well. Nick, we'll start with you. What have you made of Terry Rozier's season? Anything that you've seen from him you wanted to talk about?
Yeah, that Heat game. I mean, he was really a non-factor for a large portion of that game. I think he came back in the overtime periods to at least play. But yeah, it's all about his shooting. I mean, the rest of his numbers are basically about on the line that they normally are. He's just having in terms of his efficiency and his value, having a tick lesser of a season than last year, and it's shooting. I mean, the last 10 games, I believe, and that goes back to Cleveland or Boston, kind of the whole slide started. He's shooting 30%. He's normally shooting above 35 at about 36. So I don't know. This team talked a little bit about fatigue heading into the All-Star break. We'll see how much of it that had to do with it. And maybe that's a factor with Terry. There's a lot of guards out right now. He's the backup point guard, so to speak, according to James Borrego. So a little bit more responsibility. He's been playing a lot more. He's been averaging about 39 minutes a game, which is, a good healthy 5 minutes over his season average. So we'll see if the legs come back and the shooting comes back with it. But certainly concerning with the rest of this Hornets slide. I think a lot of it was obviously overshadowed by how cold Kelly Oubre was, because Terry's still above the 30 line, but he's barely there. Mm-hmm. So when you're putting together, I mean, the last 2 games were really bad. I think he hit 3 out of 9 or something to that effect. So just like with everybody else, it's the 3-point shooting that concerns you the most.
Well, I think fatigue is absolutely a factor when it comes to Terry Rozier and some other players as well. And that's what happens when you enter a season without an NBA level big rotation. It's going to be more demanding on your guards overall defensively to keep the ball in front. And then offensively, Terry has had to shoulder a lot of load, especially late, and shooting the basketball a lot. And I think Montrezl Harrell will help the latter problem. He doesn't really necessarily help the former problem. But now that you have somebody that can finish at the rim, you have another offensive option. It's going to take some of the pressure off of Terry Rozier and others to constantly shoot the Hornets into games or shoot the Hornets into leads. So I think that's a positive step. But bottom line is Terry Rozier has been a common factor when the Hornets have won big games against Milwaukee, against Boston. When they beat good teams, you can pretty much count on Terry Rozier having a big game. And so they need him to step up. In 22 games left, this team is going to need to do better than just 500. They're going to have to do significantly better than that if they want to make the playoffs. If they want to make the play-in, they still have to play well. And Terry Rozier is going to have to be a big factor in that.
Yeah, Terry Rozier and Kelly Oubre are kind of the 2-player stat line you might look at most in correlation to how many games they win. Both of those guys, if they're playing well, then the Hornets are probably going to win. If they don't, then the Hornets are probably going to lose. Those are the stat lines most representative of the win-loss column for the Charlotte Hornets. For me, the fatigue thing with Terry, that was used a lot last year. Terry Rozier, there were a lot of injuries, right? Gordon Hayward goes down, Malik, Lamelo, Devontae Graham is banged up. There were a lot of injuries that the Charlotte Hornets suffered, and it was Miles Bridges who had to step up and did. I mean, answered in an unbelievable way. The guy was awesome, lights out. Terry Rozier was not. And I think a lot of people kind of put that more towards fatigue, and he did not have a good second half of the season. He was not shooting the basketball well. And so now here we are talking about fatigue again for Terry Rozier. When you don't have as many injuries, they're still dealing with some, Gordon Hayward, Jalen, Cody for sure. Gordon being the guy offensively that would carry a lot of responsibility that has to be delved out to Miles, to Lamelo, and Terry himself. But at some point, do we just accept that Terry Rozier needs to go back to some kind of less shot attempts per game? And if there is more responsibility added to him over the course of a regular season, he just can't handle it? Because this is 2 years in a row now. And if you go back to after the All-Star game last year, the shooting percentages as a whole just aren't very good. 2 years ago, when the season was shortened because of COVID immediately during that Miami Heat game. They're playing a game when the season shuts down. At that point, Terry was absolute flames coming back from the All-Star game, like probably 10 games or so, 15, shooting above 50% from three. And Terry talked about how his confidence shot way up and how he accepted his new role, how everything was great, and it was working for him. After All-Star break last year, he wasn't very good. And now you're watching him kind of tail back down again. And overall, his numbers just in general this season are down compared to where they were last year. Who's the real Terry? Like that's the question that we have. And that's why it was scary for me when they offered him that much money. And now, like, he's got to hit threes at a better clip than 36% because that's the biggest way he helps this team.
Yeah, and one thing with him and the Hornets bringing him here in the role that they did and giving him that contract is, he's kind of an unknown commodity as a starter for a full season. And maybe that's bearing itself out right now. I mean, when he was playing, 75 to 82 games in a season, his minutes were about 22 minutes per game with Boston and, had the playoff success. So either he hasn't developed into that full season go-to guy yet, or he's just not going to. And that, when you put it in that context, Walker, is the scary part about the contract that they gave him, because he's certainly been a plus for this team. He's certainly won big games and hit big shots, but can he do it now that we're getting towards March and April and here even in late February? Can he do it?
I wanted to back up your claim, Walker, about Terry Rozier and Kelly Oubre and their shooting percentages essentially being predictors of wins and losses. So I ran the numbers. In wins versus losses, in losses, Terry Rozier shoots 12 percentage points less field goal percentage. Kelly Oubre's percentage drops 15. That's by far some of the bigger gaps, the two biggest gaps. Lamelo pretty consistent in wins and losses. Gordon consistent in wins and losses. Miles drops about 8%, but 12 and 15, by far the biggest gap. So you're right. Kelly Oubre and Terry Rozier, when they're shooting well, the Hornets win. When they're shooting poorly, the Hornets lose.
Well, and that's what's a little scary too about this team being, so dependent on shooting, and even from those guys, because that's the flawed plan, right? Like Mitch Kupchak, I had some problems with what he did this offseason. You fall back into Kelly Oubre, where kind of Kelly's looking for a bigger contract, doesn't get it. Hornets maybe looking for Rashawn Holmes, don't want to offer it to him, whatever. And then they just kind of come together at the end of free agency. And it seemed like Kelly really wanted to play here. I think that was genuine, him being excited to play here. But to rely on his shooting the way you did, that was always something that was shaky because he had never shot that well before. And when you rely on something that's never happened before, like that's fearful of this thing dropping and then the team dropping. Where Terry, we had seen bona fide shooting numbers from him. Like that's one thing, catch and shoot. Those numbers are legit. And what's great about Terry too this year, like after I, talked about his fatigue, the one thing that is good from him, his 2-point percentage is up. That was an outlier last year. And this year it stayed consistent. That's great to see that stay the same level. And now we'll go into these 22 games here in just a moment. But, that's the thing. Like, can Kelly get to just average? Like, can you give me a middle of the road game, Kelly? Terry, can you start to give me good games? Not great, but can you give me the 18 on 45 from the field and 37, 38 from three, even higher than that? And we can go to the next segment in just a moment. Nick, you wanted to say something else about Terry real quickly?
Well, just what you guys are saying. I mean, I think we saw that in the Heat game specifically, a little recency bias here, but, Terry cold, take him out of the equation. Kelly hits those three in the first half, and it's like, okay, Heat check, it's on, they're in the lead, they build a big lead, then he goes cold, hits only one more, and that lead eventually dwindles down. A lot of other reasons behind that, but if he could have just come in and hit a few more threes, and if Terry could have, that would have kind of stabilized things instead of the collapse that we saw. Another one.
Yeah, so we'll see what Terry can do these next 22 games. We'll talk a little more about his outlook coming up next. Not before we talk about Built Bar, though. This is the time of year that a lot of people have given up on a lot of their New Year's resolutions, especially when it comes to getting fit. It's almost late. It's kind of late February now. It's like, all right, I've been there, I've done that. But don't give up. Go to Built Bar or go to built.com, get you some Built Bars because they're so good. It's like you're eating candy, and yet it's good for you. They're high in protein. They're covered in 100% chocolate. They're low in carbs. They're low in sugar, but they're also high in fiber. So go to Built.com, use promo code LOCK15 and get 15% off your order. Again, use promo code LOCK15 for 15% off at Built.com, and go get a box of delicious Built Bars with tons of flavors, whether it's the staples or whether it's the limited edition flavors. We'll continue to talk about Terry Rozier coming up next on the Locked On Hornets podcast.
You are listening to the Locked On Hornets podcast.
Main character for American Psycho was Patrick Bateman, which really confused me. I always thought that Jason Bateman was Patrick Bateman, and that Patrick Bateman was Jason Bateman.
It's time for more of the Locked On Hornets podcast.
I don't know why that simple one makes me laugh as much as any of them, but it's the simple ones, man. The simple bums that make me chuckle.
Maybe like Jason Bateman could do a spin-off of that movie, but it'd be like a little funnier as opposed to grotesque and horrific. Like Christian Bale's version
is a little bit of a dark comedy, maybe
unintentional. There is. I mean, yeah, there is, but it would be like more sarcastic, like dry humor instead.
Let's do that. Let's get that film making in progress for sure. Let's all do it. All right, let's continue to talk about Terry real quickly. Just kind of digging deeper into the numbers here. I look at corner threes. It's kind of interesting from Terry Rozier. If you look at some of the different shots he's taking this season compared to last year, he's actually taking 36% of his threes from the corner compared to only 24% of his threes from the corner last year. But he's shooting a lot less. Last year, he was shooting 45% from the corner. This year, he's shooting 38%. Still after that, like every other shot, he's taking at the same rate, which is interesting. He's just not hitting at the same rate. So you look at the rim, mid-range, three-point shot, kind of taking the same exact frequency of those attempts and just not making them nearly as much. And I think that's why you've seen the efficiency go down. Nick, what is your belief in Terry Rozier the next 22 games? What's your prediction, kind of belief in what he means to this team and their ability to get to a play-in game or maybe just an outright playoff spot?
Yeah, I mean, there's a handful of guys that mean a success to this team because this is a team built on any of these guys could score 25 or more at any given game, or at least that's the way it was when things were going well. So, I think, like we've talked about, I think Terry will get his legs back. I think, he's a confident shooter. He's a confident player. He needs to get a bit of that confidence going in. He needs to have a good game early in this 22 game stretch to kind of be a catalyst to get him going. I think he will. And I think he'll hit a big shot or two down the stretch here. But, I think just like everybody else was kind of trapped in this lull heading into the All-Star break, and it's a damaging one. I mean, they lost 11 of 14 games. That is going to have a massive effect on where they finish. But I think that Rozier, for all the reasons that we mentioned, with the help from Montrezl Harrell and getting other guards back and healthy, hopefully, I think Terry Rozier can have a little bit more success than he has the last sample of games that we talked about. It might not bring his numbers up to where they were last year, likely won't at this point, but I think he'll have some good games down the stretch.
Yeah, and despite that weird absence in the final game, since the Montrezl Harrell deal, and Montrez and Terry Rozier are friends off the court, he seemed to be re-energized. I mean, he had the triple-double. So, I mean, he seemed to be reinvigorated by that move. And so all you hope is that carries over into the second part of the season, because the bottom line is that Terry Rozier is the heart and soul of this current iteration of the Hornets. And there's probably going to be a little bit of transfer of heart and soul over the next couple of years. But right now it's Terry Rozier. He's the guy that was bringing everyone together in the offseason. He's the guy that's hitting clutch shots and that everyone trusts in the fourth quarter. And he has to be the player that steps up if the Hornets have any shot at making waves, not just getting into the play-in game, but not getting shellacked, embarrassed like they did last season to Indiana.
Yeah, let's go with Rank Radio, right? Let's go to my bread and butter and start Rank Radio. So if we talk about Terry Rozier being the heart and soul of this team, and we know that he's certainly a leader. LaMelo loves him. People look up to Terry. He's somebody that steps up in big time moments the last couple of years. The clutch time shooting, I think, has been down this season. But if you look at Terry, like, where does he rank compared to LaMelo as far as importance to winning games? Where does he rank compared to Miles Bridges, somebody else that was top 10 front court vote getter in the All-Star game? Like, despite some of those guys being more talented or meaning more to the future of this team, is Terry number one over Melo? Like, or is Melo clearly number one, and is he number two? Doug, we'll go with you, Rank Radio first. How would you kind of list this hierarchy of like how much Terry means compared to some of these other pillars on the squad?
Well, I think we just went over it in the last segment. I mean, you look at the numbers; it's clear. Like Terry, when this team is winning, Terry is shooting the basketball well. I think that means that in this current iteration of the Hornets, he represents one of the more important players on this team. And I think again, this team will slowly transfer power over to LaMelo. He is slowly, probably a lot slower than some people would like, is getting the keys to this offense and the keys to the fourth quarter and and all of those things that you would expect from a future / current star player in the league. But I think for this season, it has been Terry. So I would put him at 1. I would put LaMelo at 2, and probably Miles at 3. And Mason Plumlee at like 342nd.
Yeah, I think that's good. Let's get the G Leaguers in there before Mason Plumlee and what
Vernon Carey at 1,950.
Hey, Ish Smith. I'll put Ish Smith up there. We still haven't done our tribute to Ish Smith video. Yeah, we need to do that one. Even if he is in Washington. Nick, do you kind of agree with that? Do you go with LaMelo first? Like, what would you?
I'll go with Terry first and LaMelo second, like Doug did. But I kind of think that LaMelo should probably take that mantle at the end of this season. I mean, he's coming off an appearance on All-Star Weekend. I thought he did some great things in that Miami game, especially in that first overtime. He had the ball. He got to the line. He made tough shots. He made great passes. Miles Bridges hit an open 3 because of that. So I think it's kind of time, and they need him to do it now. So I'll say, like, here on Tuesday, 2-2-2-2-2,
Thank you
right?
for that.
Yeah. That LaMelo needs to take this thing over here in the last 22 games.
I totally agree with you, Nick, and I back you up in that he has, even before the All-Star break, was starting to ascend into that primary scoring role. He had the back-to-back 30-point games, and it was him and Terry both were sort of just scoring wise, and a lot of it on a lot of it on LaMelo was the foul trouble that he found himself in. But both of them took a backseat in scoring in that game. But I think you're right. I think the transfer of power really needs to happen and coincide with the Hornets acquiring enough wins to get into the play-in game in the back half of this season.
Well, yeah, talking about being the closer, it was interesting at the beginning of the season. Both of those guys would talk about, I'll defer to you, you defer to me. It's whoever has the basketball. And you would see that kind of play out. They would talk about it in post-game or in an interview with Ashley Shamity. And then LaMelo and Terry would be in the backcourt, closing seconds. And then you'd see LaMelo throw it to Terry. Terry would size up the defense. Nah, LaMelo, you got it this time. And that was kind of cool. You've seen LaMelo deliver that shot against Milwaukee where he's going to his left and hits a floater. Awesome. You saw it in this game against Miami that they most recently played. I mean, what a monster and one opportunity that he had where he was draped all over. I think it might have been Duncan Robinson, which is interesting that Miami put him on LaMelo anyway. But I think it was a mistake, and he got fouled and he hit the shot. And so you've seen some clutch moments from him, but that's what's interesting with Terry too, right? Like I mentioned it briefly, that guy was one of the best clutch shooters in the league, and maybe don't even need the caveat of saying one of. Like 2 years ago, I think he was literally the best clutch shooter with a team that found themselves in those types of situations constantly. I do wonder how that baton is being handed off to LaMelo, how slowly it is, maybe how fast that baton is being handed off. So we'll see final 22 games because they're going to be extremely important, trying to avoid getting out of the play-in or playoff altogether, and what kind of work you can do trying to climb up all of those standings. So that's your recap of Terry Rozier, kind of looking at how he will play in the next 22 games. Tomorrow, we have Wes Bryant. We'll talk more about Miles Bridges. We'll continue to do this as the week goes on. Nick, thanks so much for hopping on with us, man. We appreciate it.
Thank you, guys. Always a pleasure.
Absolutely. Nick Carboni joining us here. Find him on Twitter at Nick Carboni, WCNC. That'll do it for Locked On Hornets. Thanks for making us your first listen every single day. Make sure your second listen is Locked On Bets. It's your daily one-stop shop for all your gambling needs. Locked On Bets is hosted by your boy Q with expert analysis and insight from Lee Sterling. It's free and available on all platforms. Tomorrow, West Wednesdays coming up tomorrow. That's how we'll end it here on the Locked On Hornets podcast. Wednesday, Tuesday, Wednesday. It's Wednesday.